So I want to look at what does it mean when we talk about transforming. What does transformation mean? And what are wage structures? So what are we trying to achieve here? And there you'll see transform is to make a marked change in the form, nature, or appearance of something. And in an organizational context, it's a process of profound and radical change. So in the debates about a national minimum wage, we need to remind ourselves about what we are doing here. What is the context of this exercise? And this is where we are now. We're in this process. Sorry, Gillett, I said I wouldn't speak anything other than what's on the slides. Just when one gets the podium. Okay. That orients an organization in a new direction. So we're being asked to do something fairly radical here. And a wage structure, as we understand it, is the levels or hierarchy of jobs and pay ranges, or the interrelationship of the levels of pay for different types of employees. It can also mean house wage composed, but obviously here we mean it in the former sense. And then just from a working paper, and we know this, some firms have a wage structure that is very compressed, while other firms have a very dispersed or high variance structure of wages. And that's what we need to grapple with. Why is that so? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? If our goal is transforming the wage structure. So these are just some slides, which I won't go through because you will have access to them, which just illustrate the extent of the gap between low-skilled pay levels and CEO or executive pay at the top end. And these are extremely high, even in terms of comparative, by comparison. The slides will be there for you, but for me, this is probably the most distressing of all of our statistics, which breaks up our average income by race group. And now let me just show you what the economically active population is. So what terrible classifications I know to label people, but this is something we still need to deal with in the South African context. And it has been mentioned that we have inherited an apartheid wage gap, which we still have really, well, we have to ask ourselves, have we grappled with it? Have we overcome it? Or are we just pretending it's not there, or it's not part of the conversation, or economically we just can't afford to think about it? But, you know, being in a higher education institution, and I'm sure you're all aware, you know, what's happening in our society, I think, should be sorry, I'm speaking above my slides again. You know, should be sounding the alarm for business. And I was hoping business was here, because a lot of what I'm trying to get across is what I think the business constituency should be hearing. So notwithstanding our statistics and 21 years of democracy, representation within the workforce is still, unfortunately, very skewed along race and even gender. So these, the white gaps tell you where white males and where, sorry, not the white gaps, the big yellow part of the apple is showing you where white males fit in. That's at the top end of the structure. And of course, we see as we go down to the low end skills, there's a racial element to that, which I think we haven't added to this conversation. I won't go through all my slides, but how well are our executives paid? And this is a purchasing power parity index designed by one of our remuneration specialists in South Africa. And it's done on, I'm not an economist, so I won't pretend to understand it, but comparing cost of living, comparing after tax, after expenses, etc. And you'll see South African executives who structure their pay with massive portions of variable pay in incentives do exceptionally well compared to, so that, you know, the idea that we need to pay competitive wages, we pay above competitive wages at the top end of the labor market. Gini coefficient, you're all familiar with where we sit. Now this is where I would have spent 5 minutes, and I've cut 5 minutes, but to ask you as an audience, or you as people sitting and deliberating a national minimum wage, why is it an economic imperative for us to compress wages? Why do we need to deal with this issue? And why is it a social issue? Because it is. It very much has economic and social consequences that I don't think have been part of this discussion, which has been largely an economic modeling discussion. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about what does the legal framework tell us, because we heard yesterday from about the Constitution requiring social justice. The Constitution requires a protection of dignity and the advancement of equality. So this is from the Constitutional Court decision reminding us about the impact of our apartheid legal structure, which prevented black people from becoming owners of property. 90% of the landmass of South Africa, senior jobs and access to established schools and universities were denied to them. Civic amenities, including transport systems, public parks, libraries, and many shops were closed to black people. Instead, separate and inferior facilities were provided. The deep scars of this appalling program are still visible in our society. It is in the light of that history and the enduring legacy that it bequeathed that the equality clause needs to be interpreted. So this is requiring of us something slightly more than other countries that have an equality clause. We have a history, and a very recent history, that we can't just ignore in these discussions around a national minimum wage. So this is what the Constitution says, and I've highlighted subsection 2 of section 9. To promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. And I know there's a level of 5, halfway, okay. There is a level of literature around dissatisfaction with affirmative action policies, and there's a counter literature saying that that is because there's a lack of understanding of history or a complete denial of the impact. And so it's a bigger discussion that also needs to take place, but we won't do that here. And so what else do we have in our legal framework to deal with the apartheid wage gap, as it were? Section 27 of the Employment Equity Act. The next speaker, Neil Coleman, will know a whole lot more about this than I do, but this was introduced after the negotiations for the Employment Equity Act, and it was expressly designed to deal with this question of pay structures, wage differentials. What is the legitimate extent of the differentials, and what are the best methods for identifying and rectifying inequitable differentials? And this is an exercise we haven't done. We've stuck with the neoliberal supply and demand, oversupply of unskilled, high unemployment, and so-called scarce skills at the top end of the market. So that's what the law tells us that we should be doing. This has not been happening, but it's been on our books since 1998. That employers, yes, they do. They submit their statement indicating levels of pay within organizations. There are some criticisms that can be leveled around the form of reporting. And employers are required to take measures to progressively reduce differentials. And we really have to ask ourselves, is this happening? So while we're trying to transform the wage structure, national minimum wage is part of that discussion, but we also should be trying to compress. Okay, and again, I ask you to think, particularly if we look at what's happening in our society and in our education institutions, on social media. Why is that happening? To what extent can we blame our high levels of inequality for this complete breakdown of the fabric of our society? So this requires actually for the Employment Conditions Commission to advise companies. This is something that hasn't happened. It's a capacity, it's a resource constraint, but it is an area of our law that remains wholly underdeveloped and which could also assist us in this debate. There are other legal obstacles which colleagues and I explore around the structures of our companies. And of course, trade unions also reject the idea of company representatives on boards. If I'd had extra time, I would have actually quoted Piketty, just to show that a lawyer can read Piketty, who talks very much about Marikana. He starts off on Marikana. He probably doesn't understand the broader context of what happened in Marikana, but he finishes on Marikana, stating that it doesn't matter if you have transparency, it doesn't matter if you disclose wages, unless you've got this democratic control of capital, you're still going to have inequality and the problems that go with that. So we do have problems in our company law, our tax law, our thresholds do not discourage excessive remuneration levels at the top end. How am I doing for time? Jeez, have I spoken too fast? Okay, good. Okay. So in addition to the legal barriers, which obviously play an important role. We have designed our company law around an English model, the UK model, the American model, which is very different from the European model. So there were other choices we could have made. The same with our taxation. We followed one particular trajectory. We could have followed another legal trajectory, and that should be part of the debate. But it's very much, well, it's our legal culture, it's our heritage, it's where we come from, that's where we are. But it is something, you know, that would have been really a useful discussion for trade unions, for government to take forward to business, and I'm not sure to what extent that's really happened. And we also have a business culture and a social culture that's just embedded in the way we do business, which for me are obstacles to compression. The fact that, you know, we don't have business here, we don't have perhaps adequate, sorry, I don't want to say we don't have adequate government, but, you know, are we having the debate in the way we should, in the mature way that we should be having the debate? We're fixated on adversarial forms of collective bargaining. We're suspicious of collaborative styles of engagement. But the way we engage is not the only way to engage. It's what our history and our culture has created us to be. But, you know, there are other things about our history and culture that we should question. Do we want to be in this style? Do we want to collaborate in a different way? So you will see from the World Economic Forum ratings, you know, labor relations in South Africa are just at an all-time low. We rated the worst in terms of labor tensions. And there's just a lack of take-up on, for example, the LRA's workplace forums. Trade unions are suspicious of them. Employers have never pushed for them. But there are other ways to have this discussion around wages. Getting worker representation, trade union representation on boards, supervisory boards. These are company law structures, but they exist in country contexts where the wage structures are much more compressed. So there are other models that we should be pursuing alongside a national minimum wage. And then I also, you know, have identified what I think is a leadership deficit or a lack of ethical commitment to the social justice project in South Africa. And I'm sorry to be picking on poor old Chris Griffiths, but his statement just really captured it for me during the mining strikes. Am I getting paid on a fair basis for what I'm having to deal with in this company? Must I run this company and deal with all this nonsense for nothing? I'm at work. I'm not on strike. I'm not demanding to be paid what I'm worth. He's saying your strike demands, you're not even worth it, but I'm worth, and he had just been paid out 17 million in a bonus, an incentive bonus, and his annual is about 6 or 7. So we have to ask ourselves a question, you know, what is the impact of this massive disparity? And there's literature out there that tells you in an unequal society with our Gini coefficient, we can't deny that we're unequal, there's no social cohesion. There's high crime, high levels of substance abuse, high mental health issues. It's not good for economic growth to be unequal to the extent that we are. It is not good for the economy. It drives up corruption levels. So there's so much to be said from an economic perspective in coming to this you know, this debate or discussion on the national minimum wage and wage structures. So, you know, you also have to ask yourself, 12,500, would that, which if we're looking at 4,000, 4,500, that seems like a good wage. And if we had had wage compression and complete transparency within the organization, would this have been a very different outcome? You know, it is the way we've structured our relationships, which we know are based on an apartheid ordering, and we need to revisit that. Here's an alternative style. A lot of the discussion yesterday was about, but if you have a national minimum wage, what about small businesses? And this is a small firm, a startup firm, a consultancy business, who decided we are going to be a good corporate citizen of South Africa. And they committed themselves to, you know, instead of saying there's too much red tape, there's too much this, they were going to comply with the law. Here's their statement. Oh, goodness me, I don't have my glasses. But, you know, they want to add value to everyone that they engage with. They want to conduct their business with the utmost integrity and respect for the laws of the country, not only in letter, but also in spirit. And they want to be profitable, but profit is not their only reason for existence. And so they've gone about this ethically, and they've explained it to their clients, and they require a certain level of ethical commitment from their suppliers and their customers. And you know, if you don't do business in the same way, and most of their suppliers are small and medium enterprises, so they, you know, transfer their ethical arrangements of how they conduct their business onto those who benefit from them. And this is how they've contributed. Full-time employment in our company has grown by 400%, in line with revenue growth of almost 500%. Through choosing to work with small and medium-sized companies as providers, we also contribute to job creation. The ratio of highest to lowest paid person is under 7, effectively meaning that no one is paid a very low wage and no one is paid an excessive salary either. So this is the type of practice we should be encouraging, we should be showcasing and saying this is how you commit to transforming wage structures in a meaningful way, rather than just debate about what the bottom line is going to be, and then there's this level of resentment. Time. I'm concluding. So all I wanted to say was that the national minimum wage is one tool in our legislative toolbox to transform the wage structure, but it should be seen within the context of this constitutional project of social justice. Thank you. 10 minutes.